Welcome to Booked, where two guys tell you about the books they're reading. I'm Rob Olson.
And I'm Olivia Sned. This week, as promised for a few weeks now, Adrenaline Junkie by Les Edgerton. This is a little weird. So I put together a synopsis from Amazon, and then I looked at the bio, which I thought was almost too spoilery for the book, because it's his bio and this is a memoir, and it was really, really long. So what I thought was, if I just do the synopsis, since it's a memoir, this can also serve as Les's bio. What do you think about that, Rob?
I mean, that's like the most innovative decision I think that's happened on this podcast in a long time.
Adrenaline Junkie is more than a renowned multi-award winning author entertaining with his life history. Les Edgerton understands the backstory matters. It influences the present, so he journeyed through his past seeking answers for why he was the way he was, seeking answers for his thrill-seeking, devil-may-care, often self-destructive behaviors, seeking a sense of personal peace. Why was he compelled to be the best he could in all his endeavors, legal or otherwise? What drove him to excel and flee success only to strive for supremacy in another field? Adrenaline Junkie holds the answers. With nothing held back, with his life-saving humor, an indomitable spirit, and a fierce courage to expose the ugly and painful, like the tough, raw, vulnerable characters Les writes about in his short stories and novels, he exposes us to a man fighting against family, society, and his own sense of injustice, fighting for a moment, regardless of how fleeting, to feel in control of his life. And as comfortable at times as Les's life adventure may be for us to witness, we come away grateful he took us with it. So settle back, meet a real-life 21st century Renaissance man, a real-life adrenaline junkie.
There you. Well, I mean, I should clap. That was very well done. There was a lot of big synopsis / bio. I wonder, like, because the bio probably has a lot of the same information, or so, you know what I'm saying? So it would have been a little awkward if we did a bio as well.
And it was really long, dude. Yeah. I think his bio could have served as the synopsis, because the synopsis says a lot of things about him as a like internally as a person.
Like, yeah, characteristics as opposed to,
Right. Yeah, as opposed to actions, which his bio would probably be a little more. But yeah, anyway, there it is. There you have it. Folks may remember we reviewed The Rapist by Les Edgerton.
Yeah, and Bomb.
I was trying to think. It was like 4 years ago for The Rapist, probably like 3 years ago for Bomb.
Yeah,
it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a little while.
So I was pretty excited to do this. This is only our second memoir for the podcast.
Yeah. The other one was Rob Robert's The Liar, or just Liar, I guess it's called.
Yep.
Yeah.
And only, I guess, our third then nonfiction.
Yeah. I love telling people when they ask what kind of books we review, like when I'm explaining the podcast to them, and they're like, what kind of books do you review? And I tell them, it's always fiction. It's always like, we avoid these genres. They're like, do you do any nonfiction? And I said, once by accident. And they're like, what?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yeah, it's a fun story.
So this is number 3. Numbers 2 and 3 were on purpose. We did know that these were not, but I don't know. It's I guess we'll see. We'll see what we thought about this.
And right up front, man, because it's a memoir, or it's classified as a memoir. We're not gonna be able to talk about it in the standard like story structure that we usually would with like plot points and character development and stuff like that, because this is just a dude writing about his life. And so it's probably not going to be a huge long conversation, because we want you to read it and enjoy it without knowing everything already. But it bears talking about. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here, and seeing where he was versus where he is. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that too.
And, this is a spoiler, I guess. We're going to have Les Edgerton on in a couple of weeks. So we're going to save some of these things to talk to him about specifically. I say it's a spoiler because then you know that he doesn't die at the end of this, because he's going to be on the podcast.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, there's some things we definitely want to talk to him about. So in 2 or 3 weeks, you'll hear Les Edgerton. So we may choose to cover some things then versus now. I guess we'll see how this rolls out. But I guess we'll get started. And the way I want to get started is I want Rob to share. He sent me a message when he was almost done reading this book last night. And I don't necessarily need you to share the message, but I want to get that thought out there, because because I've run into it myself. So can you kind of give us the gist of what you sent me?
Yeah, I'll just read the message because it's not going to sound any more eloquent if I just try to wing it. I said, this is the book that reads like the book everybody thinks they will write when they say, man, I really should write a book about my life, but they shouldn't. And I guess the emphasis might not have come through to Livius, but like the average person who just has normal life experiences thinks that it's going to be interesting to everybody else. And practically every one of them is wrong. I've had the same thought myself. But I know that my life experiences, on paper would really not be that exciting. But this book is what everybody thinks that's going to be for them.
Yeah, I guess partially because of the nature of the work I do. Outside this podcast, I've run into a few people that are either working on their autobiography or talk about it, and I always kind of have that same feeling. Like, I'm standing here talking to you right now, and I am failing to see the things that you could have done that were extraordinary enough for me to want to read about it. Now, I don't know, had Les Edgerton had said that to me when we met back in Indianapolis, Indiana, I don't know, a few years ago, would I have looked at him and thought, yeah, sure, buddy, like I do most times. But I think that the gist of your message is that this doesn't come off that way.
It's the real deal, I guess, is I guess the short way of saying it. Like, and honestly, I hadn't thought about this till now, but I have a brother who's a year and a half older than me, and what makes me I guess without going too deep into it, Les's book reads a little unbelievable, but the North Star for me in perspective on this is my older brother, and he hasn't had such a wild life as Les depicts his own life in this book. But it's similar enough in like the rowdy, the fighting, the criminal activity, blah blah blah. But also like the womanizing, where I'm like, it's not outside the realm of possibility. So I think had I not had my brother's stories to hear over the years, like I might have been like, this is totally made up. But because I have him and have experienced his experiences, I find Les's book to probably be really, really super unembellished.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that you almost have to do. Like, you have to remind yourself that people have different experiences than you do. So I know exactly what you mean, because there are times where I was reading and I was like, oh, all right, come on. But then I felt like, who am I comparing Les to? I'm comparing Les to the only person I can compare a memoir to, which is myself, right?
Yeah.
So we have to remember other people lead more adventurous lives, or I don't know. I think back to Cherry, the Nico Walker book. Was that his name, Nico Walker?
Yeah.
Kind of the same thing, right? I mean, that's, it's proposed as fiction, but it sounds like it's virtually a memoir. When you read about the guy's actual life. And you think to yourself, it's the same thing. Have you have read that? When we were reading that book, you were reading it as fiction, kind of lightly knowing that it's based on his life. But a lot of it would seem unbelievable to you if someone said, hey, here's a story of my life. And you'd be like, oh, this sounds a little out there. But you know what? You and I, well, all right, I'll speak for myself, did not run in drug dealing circles or didn't serve in the military. Well, but you know what I mean? Like, so comparing their experiences to mine or to yours, it's something you kind of constantly have to remind yourself. And it's good that you have a grounding presence in your family that you were able to draw from for that grounding effect.
Yeah, because I think, like you said, like if you just have your own personal experience to go off of, it could seem a little ridiculous. And so we might want to talk a little bit about how that sounds. I want to start out by saying that the book fairly chronologically is in a straight line. It doesn't jump around to like, this is something that happened in my adulthood and then this is flashing back to when I was a kid. It's pretty chronological. And toward the beginning of the book, you learn more about Les's childhood, and he had kind of a crazy religious mom and a hard ass father who was very strict and very like the pinnacle of macho,
a man's man,
total man's man.
Yep.
And so the start of the book is really kind of just establishing what type of environmental factors could lead to him getting into all of the fucking stuff he gets into throughout his life. And it's just the strict upbringing, but it's also, being poor. But and then there's kind of a dichotomy because part of his life when he lived in Texas, grandma was a very successful business person and kind of spoiled him a little bit. So he had a taste of the good life. But then, like, when they weren't living by grandma, they were in Indiana. It was, they were poor, but they were too proud to ask for money, and taking charity was a bad thing and stuff like that. So you get to experience all of the kind of environmental factors that would lead to kind of the personality that's presented in the synopsis, which is like, a guy who, wants to experience everything and takes everything head on and stuff like that.
Yeah, and to be fair for people who don't know Les, and I don't think we mentioned this, Les is in his mid-70s now, I believe.
Yeah.
So time, the era plays a very important role, not just in what happens. So like that whole kids fighting and getting into fights all the time, like I think culturally, I guess it depends on where you live and stuff. I just think there's less of that nowadays than there was. Yeah. It's just not as accepted. If you got into a fist fight and really beat the shit out of somebody, let's just say in the 60s, cops may have come, broken it up, sent everybody on their own way. Now, if you beat the shit out of somebody, right, you're far more likely to face strict criminal charges, right?
Yeah.
So I think that we have to make sure that we're viewing some of the stories through the lens of the time that they occurred in. As we have to do, I think, I don't know, I feel, and this is talking about the book in general, like I think Les did what seems like a very honest and proper job of showing us things through the element of the time frame that they happened in, but then also commenting on it through a more modern view, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So there are times where he says something that might be a little jarring to read in 2018, where you go, oof, man, I'm surprised he used that terminology for that, or that word for that person, or whatever. But he does it in a way that he lets you know, hey, man, this is what the 70s were like.
Yep.
But in a way that doesn't lead you to I don't know, to judge him as a person by today's standards. And we've talked about this in other books too, right? Because we've read books that were much older, and we've had to talk about, again, what's acceptable today, or what the current climate is today versus what it was then, and accepting it for what it is. But I think he does a good job of balancing the two by and large.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes from the general the tone or the approach of the way he writes it. He writes it like he's telling the story directly to you, and so I feel like that kind of cushions whatever he's saying in a way, because it's just a dude. He very much embraces like the warts and all kind of approach. Like, he's not trying to make himself look good. He's probably actually leaning more towards like talking about like how like the negative aspects of himself, but in a way where he's just being open and vulnerable about his life, not like he's pushing an agenda or like trying to espouse beliefs. He's just saying this is what it was, and so that kind of like direct storytelling approach, I think, helped a lot with not getting mired down in like the words he used, but also because he was just being very authentic, like you said, to the time. Like if an N-word pops up, it's because that's what someone said about someone. At the time, he wasn't like, oh, back then we used to beat up the N-words, like that kind of thing. So
I gotcha. And I think you're right. So I mean, I want to kind of ask, I guess, do you think then, so I would call this a very conversational tone, right? Because I felt the same way. I felt like I was sitting with Les at a bar or whatever, and taking in stories from his youth. But if this was written as a memoir by an omnipotent narrator, I think then maybe some of that would be a little muddier. Like on do you think
like I think it would take a little more finesse. Like if it was written from like an omniscient perspective, like you would have to say like back in those days they would say or something like that to kind of like put it in a context. You don't need those kind of context modifiers with the way he tells the story.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, from a start, like I don't want to talk about any of this, right? So we see Les through his very young years, so even 7, 8, 9 years old in Texas, and we see him kind of move around. They do a little bit of moving back and forth between Indiana and Texas, and in his teenage years, there is Rob had already mentioned fighting, and then we kind of move into the criminal aspect of his life. And it's well known because it's in his bio. We've talked about it here on the podcast before that he served a couple of years in prison, not got locked up overnight, not did 30 days. Like he was in a legit penitentiary.
Yeah. Well, there was a pinch of the book that was his military service before it really got into his like criminal activity. But yeah, like I would say that the first big change in his life was prison, because he was that, like the synopsis said, thrill-seeking, devil-may-care, self-destructive kind of person up until like he started getting into crime, and it was when he got busted and went away to jail that like his his perspective of the world changed. He wasn't always going to win the fight and stuff like that, and so that was an interesting turn. Was like prison changed him into not necessarily less of a criminal, but it probably saved him from some really sobering problems that would arise if he didn't have that perspective.
An interesting thought I thought was interesting that I had during reading some of his criminal escapades is how much easier it was in those days. Right. Didn't everything seem super easy? He was like, went to a bar. I broke the window, reached in, unlocked the door, stole $1,800 or whatever. I'm just, I'm making it up off the top of my head. But I don't know that today it's that easy to be a criminal. And again, I'm not belittling his ability to be a criminal in any way. It's just how the world has changed, how technology has made it far more difficult with cameras everywhere and even facial recognition technology and security systems. There's a number of scenes where it's like we approached this place. It was late. It was 2 a.m. and we went in and we took the stuff. And I'm like, that's all it was. Like there didn't need to be an elaborate story about how they did it because that was it. And it was a little scary because I'm thinking to myself, man, if it was that easy, how much easier would it be for me to do that today or when I was in my, whatever, late teens or early 20s or whatever, if I really thought it was that easy to do it. So it kind of made me, sympathetic, I guess, in that, like, it's just that easy and you keep doing it and keep getting away with it. You get the rush of doing it, but you also aren't as likely to face the consequences, I feel, as you are later. So.
Yeah. And I wonder, like, because I've worked in retail a good amount in my life. And so I've seen the people just walk into a place and take something and walk right out. And so I feel like a lot of the easiness of crime is your mindset. Like the more you're convinced that it's going to work, and he even says something similar to that in the book. Like the more you're convinced it's going to work, the more likely, you're probably going to be to succeed. But there is the fact that he got caught, and so, like as easy as it was, I feel like you escalate, you do something worse, or you do something more frequently, or something, and eventually something goes wrong. In this case, it involved
some rat motherfuckers.
Yeah, some fucking rat. So in that case, maybe he was great at burglaries and stuff like that. It was burglaries. He wasn't like an armed robber or anything.
Correct.
It was primarily burglaries. And in this case, it wasn't his skill. It was who he put his trust in. Some dumbass who then They rolled so fast on him too. So Yeah, and then I don't want to, like, the circumstances about him actually, like the plea and everything. I thought was and I don't know if we want to talk about it, but like what gets him actually into prison was one of those kind of character moments too, where it's like, had he made a different decision about how he was going to approach like taking a plea or not, he might not have had to go to jail.
Yeah.
Which I thought was good. It spoke to, regardless of how reckless and crazy and just ballsy and probably stupid he acted on a regular basis, like there was some sort of grounded, goodness somewhere, like the whole time.
Yeah, and I don't think that we're, as people, I don't think we can be roundly judged on one particular aspect of our life. So you and I just thought, so really we addressed him being a criminal is what we just talked about and said, well, it seems like he might have still been a good guy, right? So someone else might look at the more womanizing aspects of his life, you know what I mean? And make a similar statement or not, someone may condemn him as this guy was a dirtbag criminal. He's always going to be a piece of crap. But someone could say that about other aspects of his life, like, the number of women that he's slept with and or let on / he goes into great detail on some of his bigger relationships. Can you imagine some of the just ones that are mentioned in passing though?
Yeah. Yeah.
The circumstances around him. So which I guess takes us into that. Les gets out of prison and goes back to enjoying a bevy of women. And that takes up, I don't want to say that particular, but these relationships take up a good portion of this story. They're all about Les. And yes, I do think he develops as a person and a character, but we a lot of times see that through the lens of some of the women that he's involved with.
Yeah. So over the years, in I don't know if I'm going to get like the timeline of all the ladies right, but there's a bunch, and they're some of them are very fleeting encounters where maybe he meets them that day and they go right to having sex. Others are actually relationships where he ends up married, and throughout the course of the book married multiple times and having children and being a father in what, like the 60s and 70s, when it was obvious that during that time he was much more embracing of like not necessarily hippie thing, but like the everybody is hooking
the good
up.
Parts of the hippie thing. Yeah.
The not hippie parts of the free love, drugs kind of life more than settling down and doing the boring Indiana family thing.
So I just watched last night on Netflix. They have a series called The 80s, which I watched a few weeks ago. And then I was kind of picking through the 70s ones. Yeah. And the one on, I don't remember what it was called. Essentially, it was on the sexuality of the 70s. Yeah. Again, is something that we need to remind ourselves, like, we're reading Les's story and what's the time frame, right? And man, this little hour-long documentary on it really made it sound like the 70s was the time. If you were going to score a ton of action, that was the time to do it. The women's liberation movement. But I mean, this is through, again, I'm watching a documentary on it, not someone saying, man, it was so easy to get laid in the 70s. They're talking about the different things that were going on in media and politics, the movements that were going on. We're coming out of the free love 60s, and the 70s is sexual liberation for everybody, not just for dirty hippies, right? So, again, some of his stories lend themselves a little more credence, when you understand the time frame that they're happening in. So I guess what I'm saying is, in 2018, I don't think there are any Les Edgertons running around living that lifestyle. I just don't think that the time lends itself like it may have in the 60s, 70s, maybe even in the 80s.
I mean, and like the thought that occurred to, like, so reading about like hooking up with sometimes stretches of like multiple different women in a given day, like day after day after day. I was like, who has time and energy for that? Like, it sounds on, at surface level, it sounds like, oh, you're hooking up with all these people, you're having all this sex, it sounds great. Mm-hmm. No, like, I like, I don't know if it's the fact that I'm 40 now or something, but like I don't. It feels like that's a lot of like not emotional, but mental energy, and also physical energy put into that. Like, it doesn't seem like it would be worth all of the effort that it would take, unless it was effortless.
So I have a couple thoughts on that, and these are things we should make a note to ask Les. First of all, I'm going to say this in what's going to sound like a funny way, right? But practice. If you do that and you do it regularly enough, that's what your body becomes accustomed to.
Okay.
I think.
So you just like you hit it's like working a muscle.
Yeah, I was going to say it's just like working out. You know what I mean? You can't run. I know I'm not judging you, but you can't run 3 miles, right? I can't run 3 miles. But if we started running every day, 6 or 7 months from now, we'd be talking about how we run 3 miles every day, and past us would be looking at us like we're nuts. Like, how the fuck do you guys run 3 miles, right? But it's because you're working up to it and you're doing it. Second of all, this did not, I don't believe, come up in the book. But is it possible that Les maybe had a little bit of a sexual addiction? And the only reason the only reason I would even say this, right? So I wouldn't say this about an author or a friend of the podcast or whatever, but I mean, we were talking about a memoir, and in reading it, it occurred to me that although he didn't touch on it, is it possible that, there was something, I mean, let's face it, right? Being amorous can be addictive. I'm sure we've all been in that position at some point in our lives with somebody, but if you're working that muscle, no pun intended, right? Often enough, is it an easier step into addiction?
Well, I mean, the book is called Adrenaline Junkie, so I guess because then because it's not like he was like going through what's the word I'm looking for, like a courtship process with these ladies. It was, and
even when he was, there was other women.
So it was more like, they could have had a boyfriend. They often had a boyfriend or a husband or something. So that could have been part of the charge too. Is like, I'm doing this bad thing, I'm getting away with it or whatever. Or, I mean, he might not have thought it was a bad thing. I don't know. But, so yeah, I guess you make a good point. Like, a guy who's an adrenaline junkie might be looking at that score as like a way to get like a little adrenaline high, a little spike.
The one other thing that I want to talk about, and it's one of those, and I guess unintended consequence maybe is the right term for it. I knew that Les was a hairstylist. I think I'm using the right term, right? A hairstylist.
Yeah.
But the fact that he learned that skill in prison, and then reading that whole section, and I mean, it kind of flashes back a little bit to it throughout the book about how many hairstylists come out of prison, because it's the one like good gig that you can get. You can go to haircutting school there and cut hair, and it's one of the better gigs in prison. Was fascinating. Because on the outside, that's not a correlation you would ever make, right? Going in to get my hair cut, guy cutting my hair, probably a felon. You know why? Because there are a lot of great felon hairstylists. Like, it's not something you would ever come to on your own.
Yeah.
But it's this correlation that was, of all the things in the book, it's one of the most fascinating things to me was that whole, like, that was the best gig to get. It was hard to get into doing that gig in the prison, but then when you got out, you were sought after. There are places that specifically, I don't want to say they hung around the gates waiting, but it almost seems like they hung around the gate outside the gates waiting for someone to come out and be like, "Hey, did you get your haircutting license while you were in there?" kind of thing. And it was just absolutely fascinating.
That demonstrates something that I feel is pretty consistent throughout the book. Is that he finds himself in situations almost all the time throughout the book where he's just on top. He comes out on top. He's, right place, right time, right connections, whatever it happens to be. He's winning. And you know what? I guess I make that sound bad. With the hairstylist stuff, it's because he was just good. And he had a lot of practice and stuff. With the businesses that were successful, dude was kind of a smart a keen business person.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just the casualness, I think, with the way that he explains those things, just made it seem like things just dropped in his lap, especially ladies, but also like the other kind of benefits of his life.
Literally, yeah.
Literally dropping in his lap.
Yeah.
And so thinking about it, because like he never says, oh, this just fell in my lap, but it mentions in the synopsis, no, in his bio that we didn't read, that he starred in porn films.
Yes.
And that was something that just randomly one day, someone's like, you want to be in a porn film? Like, he didn't have to work for it. Like, he did, you know what I'm saying? Like, it just like something that just occurred. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's pretty consistent throughout the book.
To be fair, because I know what you're saying, like he was able to get jobs in like really good hair salons.
Right.
He won 16 state championships for hairstyling.
Yeah, so I guess that's a good CV.
That's super impressive. And this made me think of when I was a youngster. So when I was in my late teens, I had a part-time job where I cleaned a hair salon. Now I tell a long story about how that happened, it was through a family connection.
How much pussy did you get at that hair salon?
None, because I was there when they were closed.
Oh, I guess.
So okay. it was I had a key. I could let myself in at any time. It was basically like 2 hours a night, and it was clean up the station, swipe down the mirrors, take out the trash, clean out the fridge, that kind of stuff. They'd leave little notes if there was something specific that needed to be done. But it was through a family connection that I did that. But one of the things that I got out of that, and this took me right back to that moment when I was 17. The person who owned the salon had was this weird business guy who was always like getting into weird shit. But at any rate, he was having a famous hairstylist, and I wish I knew what this guy's name was, coming from New York to cut hair in his salon for a few days, and they would split the profit or whatever the business deal was, right? But this guy charged like $100 a haircut, which at the time, the other place I went to was $5.
Yeah.
So so he said, hey, because this person was, they were sort of business partners with my parents, and that's how I got the gig working for him. At any rate, he said, hey, I've got this guy coming. If Livius wants to get his haircut, like I'll have him just do it on the house if he just wants to get his haircut. And I thought, well, this is really cool, right? So to be fair, it was really not a whole lot different than the way I normally got my haircut. But I was thinking about this guy because I was reading this $100 haircut thing that Les was talking about, and I remember like I've had a $100 haircut, and I go right back to sitting in this chair and thinking like the guy. So I expected, some skinny, maybe gay guy that was charging $100 to get his haircut. And when I think about this guy, it's a black guy who was bald, kind of stockier. And this guy could have been from the prison haircutting school. Like, he was not what I expected. He was not the normal person that cut my hair. And at the time, I thought it was a little weird. I didn't think much of it. You know what I mean? But it's like, at that time, I had mostly women cut my hair. And then there was the foreign guy who owned my shop that I used to go to get my hair cut, where those are the only people I had exposure to cutting hair. And this guy came in, and this guy definitely could have been from a prison barber school program. Now that I think about it, and I really wish I knew his name because I'd love to find out if he was.
I was waiting for that moment where you're like, I think Les Edgerton cut my hair.
No, I've met Les, definitely not Les, but yeah. But as a haircut, it was okay. I remember thinking like, man, I'm so glad I didn't pay a fucking $100 for this haircut. Like, it's a good haircut, but I feel pretty much like I do when I get my $5 haircut at Hair by Nick's in Chicago.
There you go. So I guess, and you'll tell me if we shouldn't talk about this, but one thing that illustrates my point about it seeming that things fall into his lap was the Charles Manson moment.
Yeah,
because he did literally nothing except for write a book. To get to the point where Charles Manson was asking if he could call Les. And that was, so that's the kind of thing. I felt like those moments were pretty consistent throughout the book.
Mm-hmm. Yep. The last thing I want to touch on, and we're not going to go into any detail. And the reason is, like I said, because we're going to have Les on, and we're going to curate what we can talk about, what Les wants to talk about. But so far we've talked about, he bangs a lot of chicks. he was a criminal or whatever, but he gets into some pretty deep stuff too. A lot of family stuff, a lot of super personal things that happened to him while he was in prison, things to do with his family, what type of parent he was. That are very, very deep and really, really sad and touching and terrifying sometimes. So, like I said, we'll let Les decide how much he wants to talk about those things when we interview him. But I do want to say that this isn't, so far we've made it sound like the man's man book. Like this guy gets a lot of pussy and he robs liquor stores or bars or whatever, you know what I mean? And he was in a porn film but he cut hair on as his job. Like there are some really dark and some very emotional portions of this book too. So I don't want us to make it sound like it's just some macho memoir. Les is definitely a person with feelings who also had terrible things happen to him, and that continue to do so. So there is, at the end of this book, there's kind of like an afterword. It's part of the book, but it's kind of like the book is wrapped up, but then, oh shit, this thing happened. I want to add this in. And then more has happened since the book has been released. And as I said to Rob before the episode started, like that's the problem with a memoir. Like it's never over, right? Until you're not around anymore. So I just wanted to mention there is some pretty deep stuff in here too. It's not just all a lot of, fights and how many chicks can I nail today.
Yeah. And I think he did a good job of almost using all of the flashy bravado kind of stuff that we talked about to illustrate kind of the underlying meaning of what this writing the book meant to him, which was to explain like why he was how he was. And that taps into a lot of like the more personal, emotional, sad, tragic things in his life. And so when you get through the whole book, everything that's like his wild, crazy life that he's led is put into perspective versus like his personal feelings and his personal like the negative experiences, but also kind of like a life philosophy. And so it's not just bragging. It's not 350 pages of bragging. It's a man just being very like vulnerably telling you this is why I was who I was. And I think that he did a great job of not even balancing things, but like just putting them together in a way that showed the bigger picture.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little self-deprecating at parts too.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that. Like, I have not lived anywhere near the life that Les has lived, but there are definitely things that have happened in my life that I wouldn't want to share as widely as this, if at all, right? So I think we all have those things that maybe we've only shared with one or two people or not shared at all. And it really feels like there was nothing Les wasn't willing to put out on display, which I appreciate. Scares me a little bit, right? Because it starts making you think about the ghosts in your closet. Skeletons in your closet. Rob has ghosts in his closet because Rob's place is haunted. The rest of us have skeletons.
Yeah. You would be too afraid of ghosts. You'd keep moving.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So, but yeah. So I mean, it was kind of nice. I just felt like we were not giving this a fair shake in the other aspect. So I wanted to mention that. We ready to? Yeah. Let's wrap this up. I do want to mention the writing style. It's very conversational, which I said before. It's also written in a way that I find amusing at times too. I just opened up the Kindle app before we started the podcast. I told Rob I just love this line. One part he talks about that he'd lost a shoe, and essentially that he says something that I'd lost a shoe, which lowers the value of the remaining one considerably, which I just thought was great. And there's a lot of that in this book. So it is. There are very serious stories told in a fairly lighthearted way that makes it super, super readable. Yeah. Which is part of my wrap up, I guess. I wasn't sure what to expect. So being that we read a couple of Les's books here on the podcast, and we'd met him once in person. Had a pretty good conversation with him too, from what I remember. And even that conversation had some really, I'm not going to disclose any of it, some pretty weird stuff in it, if you remember, that was not in this book, which is fine from a time frame standpoint. But you remember what I'm talking about, right? Les had just had some weird shit go down for him that day. So, and based on having known his bio and stuff there, a lot of it wasn't surprising, right? Like, I knew he'd been to prison. I knew he'd, cut hair. There were a variety of things I knew about him. So I kind of knew what to expect. What I didn't expect, I hate saying it this way, was to enjoy it as much as I did. So when I say that, we did Liar by Rob Roberge, which I thought was great. This was more entertaining, I thought, than that. So a book can be really good, and this is really good, but it was also entertaining. So I was, cracking a smile here and there, or chuckling at something, or as I said it, a couple parts, kind of thinking about my own life versus what I was reading, which made it super enjoyable. I don't have a lot of negative things to say. If this was a fiction book, I would talk about, oh, we really should have fleshed out that bad guy in the New Orleans situation. I'm just making things up, a little better. But this is a memoir, right? So what am I going to say about the story? The story is the story. It is what it is. So it's in how it's told and how it affects you as a person. Got really sad a few times reading this as well, which, like I said, we'll talk about hopefully in a couple of weeks when we have Les on. It's just a really well put together book. I go back to what Rob says. People think that this is what they're going to write when they write a memoir, but that's not what's going to happen. This is what happens when Les Edgerton writes a memoir. I really, truly enjoyed this, and I'm going to give it 5 stars.
All right. I guess I'm going to try not to say too many words in my wrap up here, because it's weird reviewing a memoir in general. But Livius makes a good point. There are often memoirs, and in the memoirs that I've read over my life, typically there is a theme of tragedy and sadness that makes the memoir worth writing. And that's not absent here, but it's not the purpose, I don't think. He wants to recount his wild life, and all of the ups and downs, instead of just like the hard parts and the adversity. It all matters in the bigger telling of the story. And so it's nice to catch fun moments and those one in a million man kind of stories, and all, like the glitz and glamour that happened, because that is instrumental in defining a person as well. So a little more lighthearted than your typical memoir, but at the same time still has that heavy impact when you consider it as a whole. So having met Les in the Les in his 70s kind of life, as opposed to Les when he was a little bit more rambunctious, hearing about his past, it was a little difficult to reconcile with how he acts now, I guess I should say. But this book makes it all kind of make sense. It kind of like focuses the lenses just right, to kind of show you who he is today and what matters to him. And I think it's great, and I'm looking forward to talking to him now after catching up on his life. So yeah, Livius is right. This is 5 stars.
All right. Moving away from Les Edgerton for a week or so. There's a couple other things I wanted to touch on. We talked about in our year-end review episode that Bird Box, right? And we gushed about Bird Box. 45 million Netflix accounts watched that movie in the first week, making it the biggest Netflix release. I believe we actually talked about this. I said, I wonder if this is going to be, based on the hype, like the biggest, thing they've had come out. And I guess it is, right? At least for an original Netflix movie.
That's what they said. It was the biggest opening 7 days ever for a Netflix film, right?
Yeah. So I don't know if that take series into account. Like, I know Orange is the New Black, which I don't watch, is really big, and Stranger Things, right? But for a movie, that's pretty phenomenal. Now, we did have Jesse, permanent staff here at the podcast, reach out and said that he does believe that Netflix is one-time payments, which was another question that we kind of had very generally about how that works. And Jesse is in the know in these things, as he is a huge fan of film, and he's the guy who knows directors' names and shit like that, stuff that I can never be bothered to remember. So I'm going to go with that. But I just wanted to mention that's a lot, and that's accounts, right? So I watched the movie with Linda, right? So that was two of us watching the movie. So that, is that 45 million people. That could be 90 million. Could be 120 million if a whole family sat around to do it. That's pretty impressive in 1 week.
Now, I don't know how much you've been paying attention to. There's a little naysaying going on about this in our group. Have you noticed any of that?
Negative.
All right. Longtime friend of the podcast, David James Keaton, is raising some questions about the validity of that and saying, like, they've never released numbers before. Why are they doing it for this first time right now? And, like, if that's true, it's more first week views than like any movie in history and stuff like that. So he's throwing around a little bit of speculation that Netflix might not be being entirely honest.
So from what I read though in the article, is that also includes international audience.
Okay, so it's a worldwide number.
Well, yeah. So, and again, why didn't they before? I don't know. Maybe their numbers weren't impressive. The thing that I did find, and there is, and this does go back a little bit to what David was saying, was people are like talking about, we need more transparency from Netflix. No, the fuck you don't. What do you need more transparency for? Like, watch the movie, like the movie. Find someone that also watched the movie that you could talk to about it, like I did with Robin books, right? It's a lot easier to do with movies, right? Because if you catch a big TV series, then half your coworkers are watching it or whatever. I don't know that we need to know those numbers, or that Netflix really owes it to anybody to say how many people watched something. I mean, the way we know for a series is that it's immediately renewed, right? Enough people watched it. You know why? Because 3 days after it came out, they greenlit season 2.
Yeah.
In a movie, I mean, God, I hope they don't try to do a sequel, but a sequel is usually a pretty good indicator if you have a movie that lends itself to being a sequel. So what would Netflix have to gain by lying, though, I guess is really the question.
Yeah, that's I don't know, and I really don't care. I honestly don't care that much. Like, the number, had it said 25 million or 85 million, it didn't matter to me. It was like, hey, lots of people watch this, and that made me happy because, like, even if they inflated that number by like 100%, and it was actually like 22.5 million or whatever. It's still a lot of people watching our boy Josh's movie, and like that's what really counts to me.
For perspective, because what this conversation and what David James Keaton said is true. Maybe more people have seen this movie than any other movie, but there's a couple things to remember. Like, I would have gone to see this at the theater because we reviewed the book and because we've interviewed Josh Mallerman and someone I'll call him an acquaintance. But like, I don't go to the movies a whole lot, right? And there's a lot of people who don't go to the movies a whole lot. But not only that, you have international. Now, as far as it being the most viewed movie ever or something like that, I thought this was right. And apparently it's not, but it's the first one that comes to mind. The Day After. Do you know what this is?
No.
You would have been just a little kid. In 1983, ABC had a movie come out that was called The Day After, and it was what would actually happen in the aftermath of a nuclear war. And this was huge news. 39 million households watched the program during its initial broadcast, which is, only 6 million less than Bird Box.
Right.
But again,
Wait,
it was
what
free.
year?
1983.
Ooh, yeah.
And these are not international numbers. That movie was only released, at least in its, this is in its initial broadcast, was only released on ABC in the United States. I don't know, maybe Canada. So I don't, this didn't get a release that was international. Internationally, it might have had 90 million people watch it. And not in the first week. We're talking about the night it was on television, because those days didn't allow itself to, there wasn't DVRing. I mean, I guess in 83, some people had VCRs, but as I remember, I think I got a first one in 85. So like, we didn't have a VCR in 83. This is something we sat down. I don't know about it as a family. I think I remember me and my mom watching it and sitting down and watching just millions of people be, wiped out in a nuclear strike and what would happen and whatever. And it was a really important movie. But again, how easy was it to see? In 83, most households had 5 channels. There was a lot of hype around the movie. Now Netflix, we talked about it before. A lot of people have access to Netflix. They didn't have to go anywhere. They didn't have to spend any money to see it.
Well, according to you, everybody has Netflix.
So I thought about that statement and the people I've been talking to over the last few days, which, quite honestly, is coworkers and family mostly. I haven't run into one person that doesn't have access to Netflix, because every time we had a conversation came up about Bird Box or about some other show that's coming up on Netflix. So, maybe it is the most viewed movie of all time, at least in its first 7 days. And we're likely to see more of that, especially if Netflix keeps putting out movies that generate enough hype.
Yeah. Regardless, I'm happy with it, and I'm happy that Josh's story is getting as much attention through viewings and memes, and all that kind of stuff.
I did look. Bird Box was back in the top. Amazon, not at the top, but it was back in the top. I think 20 of the bestseller. Yeah,
nice.
I think I looked the day after we recorded the episode. I don't remember what the number was, but I checked and I was like, oh yeah, that's the Kindle version of it is up in the top 20. I think it was. So
I don't think it's. I think it is conspicuous, maybe, that Inspection, that Del Rey has it up for pre-order, like right now.
Yeah.
And they're pushing it pretty hard, because I would ride the waves of the success of like the theatrical release of the Bird Box movie. And honestly, I think I said it when we were talking about watching the movie Bird Box, but I'll say it again. Just looking forward to the film adaptation of Unbury Carol, because that's going to happen, and that's going to be fucking amazing.
Dude, Inspection, the people at Del Rey right now are trying to figure out how to get the Sandra Bullock meme on the cover of Inspection. Like, how can we just incorporate that image of her in the boat with like her hands out?
Yeah, right.
Like, how do we get that on the cover so people know that this is the book they need to buy? Unbury Carol would be interesting. That would definitely be an interesting film to watch.
I'd watch Black Mad Wheel too.
Yeah,
any of it. House at the Bottom of the Lake.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. But I imagine that in Inspection, if the movie rights have not been purchased yet,
it will happen.
While we're on the subject of Netflix, Bandersnatch, the new Black Mirror, is this something that you took time to watch over the last couple days?
I don't care.
I don't. All right. So you say that, and I know we've talked about Black Mirror before. Like, neither one of us has watched a ton of Black Mirror. I've seen 4 episodes, and that's from like 2 different seasons. So not something that I've, made it a note to watch. This one was interesting, though, because of its choose your own adventure format.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really clever. So for anybody who hasn't seen it or hasn't heard about it, essentially you're watching a movie. It's about a kid in the 80s who's trying to adapt a video game. He's trying to adapt a novel into a video game. That novel is not the choose your own adventure that you're thinking of if you're my age, Rob's age, and they're thinking about choose your own adventure. It's like 1,000-page tome. Mm-hmm. But apparently there are a lot of decisions that you have to make through the course of reading that book. And he's trying to adapt it into a really shitty 8-bit video game. 1983, I think, is when this takes place. But at certain points, you're presented with options that come up on screen that you have to select in order to advance, which I think is was done very well. So the actual technology of it was super smooth. While you're watching a scene, a little black strip would roll up from the bottom of the screen. That the first one, I think, is which cereal you choose to eat in the morning. This kind of gets you in the habit of doing it. And you pick between, I don't know, Wheaties and Cheerios or whatever it was. But there is the movie doesn't stop. Like, when I was thinking about how this would work, is I pictured I'd have to make a choice, and like the boxes would come up at the bottom, like when you're done watching something and something would have to load again. Mm-hmm. it's completely seamless. As you pick, the part that you're watching continues on for another minute, and then it's a direct cut to the next scene. Yeah, it's completely seamless.
So
which is really nice.
It builds into like an upcoming scene break instead of
correct.
Like, cut to like a harsh cut to black, and then like the new scene shows up. That's nice.
When a choice comes up, like there's a part where he's talking to a therapist, and the therapist says, "I really think that you should talk more about what happened with your mother." And then she goes on to, so options come up. Talk about it, don't talk about it. But the therapist goes on to say, I think it would really help with with us getting, further into the cause of what's bothering you or whatever. So at this, while she's saying that, you've made a selection. And then it just cuts back to him saying, no, I really don't want to talk about it. Or saying, I think you're right. So yeah, it was done super, super smoothly. There are also parts that cause you to start over. But when you start over, it's through a series of snippets. So if you've watched 20 minutes and I had to start over, it was like a minute of recap up until the part where I start over to make a new decision, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So from an experience standpoint, it's definitely worth watching. I don't want to spoil this. Afterwards, I'll tell Rob what I thought was really goddamn brilliant about it. Because I was super, super impressed with something, but I feel it's spoilery for anybody else. But yeah, Bandersnatch. It's going to be interesting to see how well this does, and if this becomes more prevalent in our TV viewing, truly interactive viewing of films and or TV shows.
Interesting point about this. I saw an article about this the other day. Didn't read it, but it's it makes sense to talk about it now because we're talking about it. Apparently, the choose your own adventure aspect of this does not work on Apple TV boxes. So
interesting.
Yeah, there's let's see, a little message pops up. Bandersnatch is only available on devices that support interactive content. No linear version is available. So basically, when you get to a point where you're given an option, it just says like not available or something like that. So, wow. It will work on an iPhone or an iPad. It just won't work on the Apple TV's Netflix app.
Interesting. Yeah, I watch it on a built-in Netflix app on an LG TV.
Yeah,
so
smart TVs.
A box. It's and that worked seamlessly.
Basically, content's limited to smart TVs, streaming media players, game consoles, iOS devices, and Android devices running the latest version of the Netflix app. For whatever reason, it doesn't. The interactive content does not work with the Apple TV. So if that's how you watch stuff, find a different way. Yeah, bummer.
Yeah, and I would, and just on another note, like, I would just think that it would be the same app that iOS uses. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's just a weird, I don't know. Yeah. So, yeah, at any rate, Bandersnatch. Be interesting to see what people think of it. I made it to 2 endings. I don't know that I'll go back. There are apparently 5 endings. And once it ended for me, I was essentially rewound to another option, like where the fork in the road was. And I got to see a second ending. And then I was given, again, the option, but it was really late and I was starting to fall asleep. So I was like, all right, I'll pass on watching a third ending for this. So really interesting, though.
Yeah, surprisingly, I just have no interest in it. I think it's because it's Black Mirror more than it's a choose your own adventure kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only other thing I wanted to mention, because I know there are some listeners to the show are big fans. I'm sure they already know this, but today's January 1st. So first of all, so now that we're an hour in, Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Yeah. Luther. The most exciting thing about 2019 is the return of Luther on the BBC, which appears to be running 4 episodes in consecutive nights. I did watch the first episode tonight, and very happy to report that I'm super excited for episode 2.
Yeah, I need to catch up. I think I only watched the first 2 series of Luther, and I know that's super disappointing to you, but it's just something I hadn't gotten around to coming back to.
Here's my honest review on that. You watched the best 2 series. Series 3 and 4 I didn't think were as good. I mean, the writing is as good, and following the character is great. I just think that those stories in the first 2 were tremendous, and this one is shaping up to be great. So we'll see more to follow in the upcoming episodes.
All right. I think the only thing left to mention is what we're going to be doing for our next episode, which is we talked about it before. This is a advanced reader copy that was we actually got the publisher reached out to us to ask us if we wanted to read this. We decided we wanted to, and it is An Anonymous Girl by Greer, Hendricks, and Sarah Pekkanen. So we're reading that now, and you'll be hearing us talk about it as our second book of 2019.
That's right. I'm really excited that we recorded on the first, because we have to get 52 episodes or more this year, not 51. So that fact that we started on the first makes me feel really good that that's not like the 8th and we're recording our first episode of the year. So I'm hoping that...
do you want to do 53 so that if you average out the 2 years, it's 52 per year?
I'm going to do the math on all of that and see what it takes. Because I know we had an episode a year. I think we were only at like 41 episodes. So I don't know. We'll have to see what the overall numbers say.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think overall, if you average out our entire history, we are beyond 52 per year.
Yeah. All right.
Whatever.
I'm not going to worry too much about it until like December rolls around. And I'm like, hey, I just looked and here's where we're at.
Let's read 6 more books. Yeah.
Exactly. So thanks for tuning in. We're looking forward to a great 2019 with you guys. And that's going to continue on next week with An Anonymous Girl. Until then, I'm Olivia Snedden.
And I'm Rob Olson. Keep reading.